Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into unanswered skies, slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave a soft, like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you're welcome to share them in the comments below. And just out of quiet curiosity, where are you listening from tonight? I love seeing how far these whispers travel through the dark. Chapter 1. When the sky began to listen. On warm summer nights, Washington D.C. has a particular sound. Not silence, exactly more like a low, steady breathing. Traffic murmurs along distant avenues. Radios hum behind open windows. The Potomac moves slowly in the dark, unseen but felt, like a long memory passing through the city. Even the monuments seem to exhale after sunset, stone holding the day's heat and letting it go one quiet degree at a time. In July of 1952, the city felt heavier than usual. People would later remember that summer as slow and thick, the kind of heat that presses down without warning and makes time stretch. Men loosened their ties after sunset. Families slept with fans aimed directly at their beds. Screens rattled softly in windows, as if the night itself was restless. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt wrong. And yet, something subtle had already begun to change. Above the city, the sky looked ordinary. Stars held their places. Clouds drifted lazily, thin and harmless. No alarms sounded. No sirens cut through the darkness. If you had stepped outside just before midnight, you would have seen nothing that demanded attention. But sometimes, the most important moments arrive quietly. Inside the control room at Washington National Airport, the air was cool and dim. Fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over radar scopes and worn desks. Coffee cups sat half-forgotten. The night shift was usually uneventful. Routine sweeps, predictable blips, the gentle rhythm of aircraft following their invisible paths in and out of the Capitol. The men on duty had done this hundreds of times before. Thousands, maybe. Radar was a language they understood deeply. They could tell at a glance whether a blip belonged to a commercial flight, a military aircraft, or something mundane like interference. The screen spoke, and they listened. That night, the screen spoke differently. At first, it was nothing dramatic, just a flicker, a hesitation, a return that didn't quite fit the expected pattern. One small echo where none should have been, then another, and then several more. 7 points of light appeared, clustered in a way that made no immediate sense. They weren't lining up with any known flight plans. They weren't following airways. They weren't behaving the way objects in the sky were supposed to behave. The room did not erupt into panic. No one jumped from their seat. There was no shouting. Instead, there was a pause, a subtle, shared stillness. The kind that happens when experienced people notice something they can't yet explain. A moment where the mind leans forward, listening more carefully. Outside, Washington slept. Apartment lights flicked off, one by one. Somewhere a radio played softly in a living room, where someone had dozed off mid-song. A bus rumbled along a nearly empty street. The White House stood calm and illuminated, unaware that unseen attention might already be drifting nearby. The sky above it all remained calm. What's interesting about moments like this, moments before history notices itself, is how unremarkable they feel while they're happening. No one thinks this will matter later. No one feels the weight of future questions pressing backward through time. It's just another night. Inside the radar room, the men leaned closer to the screen. One of them adjusted a dial. Another checked the time. The echoes remained, not flickering now, but steady. Present. They moved, not fast at first, not aggressively, just oddly. A hesitation here. A slight change of direction there, as if whatever was reflected on the screen was deciding something. Radar operators are trained to distrust first impressions, to assume error before anomaly. So they cross-checked. They verified. They looked again. The returns were still there. Above the city, no engines roared. No contrails marked the sky. No lights blinked in familiar patterns. If you had been standing on the National Mall at that moment, gazing upward, you would have seen stars exactly where you expected them to be. And yet, something was sharing that sky. There's a particular kind of awareness that arrives when routine breaks not loudly, but gently. A sense that the rules you rely on might be incomplete, that the world is about to show you a seam you hadn't noticed before. For the men watching the radar, that awareness arrived quietly and refused to leave. They called for confirmation, another scope, another set of eyes. The echoes appeared there, too, independent and consistent. This was not a trick of a single machine. This was something being observed. Still, no fear, just curiosity. Curiosity is often the first response to the unknown. Fear comes later, when curiosity runs out of familiar explanations. The night outside remained warm and still. Cicadas sang from trees, lining quiet streets. Somewhere near the river, a couple lingered on a bench, talking about nothing important at all. The city did what cities always do when they believe they are alone. Above them, unseen. The sky listened back. The radar returns drifted closer to restricted airspace. Not rushed, not careless, almost polite, in a way that's hard to explain. They hovered at the edges of expectation, close enough to be noticed, distant enough to remain ambiguous. What would you have thought, sitting in that room? Would your first instinct have been danger, or confusion, or a strange, unnameable sense of being observed? The men did what professionals do. They documented, they monitored, they waited. Time moved forward, but it felt altered, stretched thin, like the air itself. The clock on the wall ticked, but each second seemed to carry more weight than usual. And then, as if to acknowledge the attention being paid, one of the objects changed behavior. On radar, it paused. Not slowed, paused, hovered. A fixed return where motion should have been constant. A small but profound violation of expectations. Moments later, a call came in from the control tower. Someone had seen something. Not clearly. Not dramatically. Just a light. Bright. Stationary for a breath or two, and then gone. Moving away at a speed that left no easy words behind. Inside the radar room, no one spoke for a moment. Sometimes, confirmation doesn't bring clarity. Sometimes, it only deepens the mystery. Outside, the sky looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The stars hadn't rearranged themselves. The clouds hadn't darkened. There was no visible sign that anything extraordinary was unfolding. And yet, something had shifted. The night was no longer empty. From that moment on, the men watching the screens would never quite see the sky the same way again. Because once you realize that something unexpected can share familiar space so effortlessly, the comfort of certainty never fully returns. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't even clearly a message. It was an introduction, a quiet one. And as the city slept on, unaware of how close the question had come, the sky held its position, calm, watchful, and suddenly full of possibility. Chapter 2. The Shape of the Unknown. By the time the clock crept past midnight, the night had acquired a new texture. Nothing visible had changed outside. The streets were still calm. The heat still pressed gently against brick and pavement, but inside the rooms where instruments watched the sky, attention had sharpened. The kind that narrows the world down to small details. Tiny movements, subtle patterns, things that only matter when something unfamiliar has entered the frame. The radar returns did not disappear. They lingered, and that, more than anything else, unsettled the sense of routine. Fleeting anomalies could be dismissed. Glitches came and went all the time. But persistence was different. Persistence suggested intention, or at least consistency. It suggested that whatever was being observed was not accidental. The objects, if they could even be called, that began to trace paths that defied easy explanation. They drifted apart, then regrouped. They changed direction without the gentle curves expected of aircraft. On this screen, they looked like thoughts, changing their mind mid-sentence. The men watched quietly, the way you might watch a storm forming far out at sea. Not with panic, but with respect. Phones rang softly. Calls were made and received in low voices. Each exchange added another layer of confirmation, another thread woven into a growing tapestry of uncertainty. Other radar stations were seeing it too, not just one location. Not just one system. Something was happening in the airspace above the capital. And still, the sky itself gave nothing away. There is something deeply human about wanting to see with your own eyes. Instruments can tell you a great deal, but sight carries a different kind of truth. So when reports came in of lights being observed visually, brief flashes, hovering glows, movements that didn't match anything familiar, the story began to step out of abstraction. Pilots were among the first witnesses, high above the city, accustomed to reading the night sky like a second language. They noticed lights that didn't blink or fade the way aircraft lights did. Lights that seemed to hold their brightness steady, as if unconcerned with being seen. One pilot described it later as a star that had decided to move. That idea lingered. A star, but closer. A star, but responsive. A point of light behaving as if it had awareness. Down below, the men at the radar scopes began to connect these reports with what they were seeing. The dots on the screen were not random. They correlated. When a pilot described a sudden acceleration, the radar showed a corresponding leap. When a light appeared to hover, the radar return paused again. Calmly, confidently. The unknown was beginning to take on a shape, not physical, but behavioral. And behavior tells stories. The objects did not rush toward the city. They did not scatter chaotically. They moved with what could almost be described as patience. As if testing boundaries, as if learning. What does it mean when something unfamiliar moves carefully? That question settled into the room like an unspoken presence. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Aggression announces itself. Curiosity does not. Outside, Washington continued its quiet breathing. In a darkened neighborhood, a man stepped out onto his porch, drawn by nothing more than the heat and the late hour. He looked up, squinting into the sky. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a brightness that didn't belong to any constellation he recognized. He blinked. The light shifted. Then, it was gone. He stood there longer than he meant to, feeling faintly foolish, then went back inside. He would not mention it the next day. It didn't feel important enough. It didn't feel real enough. And yet, moments like that were happening across the city. Small, private encounters. Glances upward. Brief hesitations. A sense that the sky was doing something unusual, without providing enough evidence to demand action. In the control room, the tension remained soft, but unmistakable. Not fear. Not excitement. Something closer to AOE, restrained by professionalism. The kind of awe that arrives when the world behaves in a way that textbooks never prepared you for. Military officials were notified. Procedures were followed. Calm questions were asked and answered. No alarms were sounded. No jets scrambled immediately. There was no clear threat to respond to. What do you send fighters after when you don't know what you're chasing? The objects seemed almost aware of this hesitation. On radar, they approached restricted zones, then drifted away again, as if acknowledging invisible lines drawn across the sky. They respected boundaries they shouldn't have known existed. That detail stayed with the observers. Respect implies understanding. Understanding implies observation. And observation implies time. Somewhere between midnight and early morning. The idea began to form not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that whatever was present had been watching long before it was noticed. The sky, after all, is a perfect place to observe from. Silent, vast, overlooked. As the hours passed, the objects gradually began to thin out. One by one, the radar returns faded. Not abruptly, not dramatically. They simply withdrew, slipping away from detection as smoothly as they had appeared. By the time the eastern sky hinted at dawn, the screens looked normal again. Too normal. The men sat back in their chairs, fatigue settling in now that the tension had released its grip. Coffee had gone cold. Notes had been taken. Times and movements logged carefully, methodically, as if precision could anchor the experience to something solid. Outside, the city woke up. Morning light spilled across monuments and rooftops. Newspapers thudded onto porches. Radios crackled with news of weather and traffic. People went to work unaware that the night had asked a question that had not yet found words. But for those who had watched the sky, something fundamental had shifted. They had glimpsed a pattern without an explanation, a presence without a name, the shape of something unknown, outlined only by its behavior and its restraint. Once you've seen that, once you've realized the sky might be more crowded, more aware, than you were taught to, don't go back to seeing it as empty space. You look up differently, and somewhere above the waking city, far beyond sight, the unknown had already moved on, leaving behind only quiet minds, unanswered questions, and the lingering feeling that this was not the end of the story, but the first time it had allowed itself to be noticed. Chapter 3. When the silence spoke back. Morning arrived gently, as if unaware of what the night had carried. Sunlight slid across Washington, D.C., touching the edges of buildings, warming stone and glass, returning the city to its familiar rhythm. Streets filled again, coffee brewed, radios clicked on. The world resumed its habits with the quiet confidence of something that believes it understands itself. But for a small number of people, the morning felt different. They moved through the day with a subtle weight behind their eyes, as though sleep had not fully released them. Conversations sounded distant. Ordinary tasks required more focus than usual. The night had left something behind. Not fear, not excitement, but a lingering attentiveness, like a question still forming. Inside offices and control rooms, the previous night was replayed again and again. Radar tapes rolled forward and backward. Times were checked, then checked once more. Distances were measured. Movements were mapped. Each detail was examined slowly, deliberately. In the clear light of day where mysteries usually shrink, this one did not. The patterns held. The objects had appeared, maneuvered, paused, accelerated, and withdrawn in ways that aligned too precisely to be dismissed as coincidence. Different systems had recorded the same behavior. Different witnesses had described the same motions, the same impossible calm. What lingered most was not what the objects did but how they did it. There had been no chaos, no erratic flight, no sudden, threatening descent. Everything about the movement suggested restraint, control, a kind of awareness that felt thoughtful. That idea was not spoken often. When it was, voices lowered instinctively, as if intelligence itself were something fragile that might break if said too loudly. By late morning, briefings began. Officials listened carefully. Questions were asked without accusation. Answers were offered without certainty. In the spaces between words, unease grew, not sharp, but steady. This was unfamiliar territory, not hostile, but not easily contained either. If this was a mistake, it was a remarkably consistent one. If it was a natural phenomenon, it behaved with unusual intention. And if it was something else entirely, no one yet knew how to finish that sentence. Outside those rooms, the city remained blissfully unaware. Tourists took photographs beneath wide skies. Office workers ate lunch on steps and benches, tilting their faces toward the sun. Children pointed at airplanes and guessed where they were going. The sky gave nothing away. That evening, news of the sightings surfaced cautiously. A few short mentions, careful language, explanations offered gently, as if to soothe rather than convince. Most people accepted them without much thought. Life has a way of absorbing uncertainty when it arrives softly, but some did not. Some people looked up longer than usual that night. As darkness settled again, the air remained warm and still, the kind of night where sound carries easily, where even distant movement feels close. Windows were opened across the city. Curtains stirred faintly. The sky stretched wide and dark above it all, patient and unchanged, until it was not. Just before midnight, radar screens flickered. This time, there was no confusion about what was being seen. The returns appeared clearly, confidently, as if the sky itself were continuing a conversation, that had paused with the sunrise. The objects were back. They emerged gradually, one by one, then in small groups, tracing familiar yet still baffling paths. They hovered again. They shifted direction without momentum. They accelerated in ways that ignored every known limitation. But something else was different. The observers felt it immediately. This was not repetition. This was response. The movements felt aware of attention now. When radar tracked them closely, they adjusted. When aircraft were dispatched, the objects did not flee. They demonstrated closing distance effortlessly, then pulling away, not urgently, but decisively, like a thought being completed. Pilots lifted into the night with steady voices and trained calm. These were not inexperienced flyers. They had thousands of hours in the air. They knew the sky intimately, its illusions, its tricks, its limits. What they encountered did not fit any of those categories. Lights appeared where none should have been, holding position against the wind, glowing without flicker. When approached, they moved not as if escaping, but as if illustrating a point. Speed without sound, turns without arcs, presence without disturbance. One pilot later described the feeling as standing near something vastly capable that had no need to prove it. Below, radar confirmed every visual report. The objects seemed to play along the edges of engagement, never crossing into aggression, never disappearing entirely. They remained just visible enough to be undeniable, just distant enough to stay unreachable. The night stretched on, inside control rooms. Fatigue mixed with awe, the usual urgency of decision-making softened into something more contemplative. What do you do when the unknown refuses to behave like a threat? The idea formed slowly, gently, as ideas like this always do. This might not be about us at all. Perhaps this was not an approach or a warning, but an observation. A presence revealing itself not to alarm, but to acknowledge. To say, quietly, "We are here." The sky had not opened. No message had been broadcast. No symbol burned across the clouds. And yet, communication was happening, not through language, but through behavior, through restraint, through patience, through silence. Near the river, a man walking his dog paused. He looked up, sensing movement rather than seeing it at first. A light glided smoothly across the stars, then stopped, not twinkling, not blinking, just pressing. The dog tugged at the leash. The man hesitated, then shook his head and continued walking, heart beating a little faster than before. He would think about that moment for years. As the night wore on, the objects gradually began to withdraw. One by one, their signatures faded. The sky reclaimed its familiar emptiness. The last radar return lingered longer than the others, holding position as if reluctant to leave. Then it was gone. By early morning, the city slept beneath ordinary skies once more. Explanations would follow in the coming days. Scientific language, reassuring tones, words designed to fold the experience back into something manageable. Some would accept them fully, others would not, because for those who had watched the sky think, explanations felt incomplete. They had not witnessed chaos, they had witnessed control. And that realization carried a quiet weight. The silence above Washington had spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to leave an imprint. A reminder that the world is larger than our definitions, and that sometimes the most profound encounters do not arrive with fear or fire, but with calm persistence. The sky had listened. And then, gently, it had answered. Chapter 4. The Day the World Tried to Explain. The days that followed the Washington sightings felt quieter than they should have. Not peaceful, exactly just restrained. It was as though the city had exhaled softly after something vast had brushed past the edges of human awareness. People moved through their routines, but there was a subtle tension beneath the surface, a pause in the collective heartbeat of the capital. Newspapers landed on doorsteps with calm, factual headlines. Radio announcers spoke in measured tones, each word chosen to soothe and reassure. Television screens displayed composed faces behind desks, explaining the events as though the sky were a puzzle already halfway solved. radar, anomalies, atmospheric interference, unidentified aerial phenomena. The phrases repeated themselves endlessly in cycles of reassurance, each time a little thinner, a little less convincing. For many, that was enough. Life demands attention. Bills must be paid. Children fed. Meetings attended. Mystery competes poorly with routine, and the strange occurrences above Washington gradually receded. For those who had seen the radar screens, or had heard the pilot's reports describing objects moving with impossible control and speed, the official explanations felt hollow. Not wrong, exactly. Just incomplete, like being handed a map with the roads marked, but the destinations missing. Inside offices and government buildings, behind curtains that stayed drawn and doors that remained closed, quiet conversations persisted. Thoughtful, measured discussions, never urgent, never panicked. Sentences were weighed before being spoken, as if the language itself might betray something too large to handle openly. "They didn't move like any craft we've ever known," said one radar operator to another, leaning over a bank of screens. "There's intelligence there. Intent. But it's different. It's not ours." The other nodded silently. "Not ours. Not anyone's. But they're not threatening." That's what's disturbing. There was a shared understanding forming in those quiet spaces. This was not something to chase. It was something to sit with. The objects had not attacked. They had not provoked. They had simply been present, hovering, observing. It was the calm of restraint, of patience, that unsettled the experts far more than fear would have. Outside the official spaces, the story lived a quieter, almost invisible life. People whispered about it late at night in kitchens and on porches, voices lowering instinctively as if the sky itself might still be listening. A neighbor mentioned a light they had glimpsed years ago, one that never left their memory. Someone else admitted they had always felt the sky was more alive than it appeared. The story became less about what happened and more about how it felt, and for many, that feeling was strangely calm. This calm puzzled scientists and officials. Panic or fear would have fit the expected narrative. But here, there was patience. There was a pause in the collective breath of humanity, a gentle curiosity taking hold instead of terror. Perhaps it was because the encounter itself had been deliberate in its restraint. It had hovered. It had observed. It had left no scars. Reports were compiled, charts drawn, and diagrams labeled. Attempts were made to translate motion into mathematics, intelligence into data. Humans are excellent at reducing the vast and the unknown into something manageable, but these objects resisted every attempt. Movements could be plotted but not predicted. Pauses could be measured but not explained. Their restraint, the most unsettling characteristic of all, did not fit into any framework. The world knew. Aggression has models. Natural phenomena have precedents. Technology leaves signatures, tis ad nona, and yet life went on. News cycles shifted. Skepticism returned to its comfortable throne. The city moved, as it always did, unaware or unwilling to dwell too long on the unexplainable. But for a few, the door had opened too wide to ever fully close. Radar operators, pilots, quiet witnesses on riverbanks or rooftops. The memory of that night lingered, subtle but undeniable. They had seen something that observed them back, and that awareness could not be erased by charts or explanations. At home, John, a mid-level FAA officer, recounted the night to his wife, her voice soft as they sat on the porch swing. "Do you ever feel watched?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when the stars look brighter than usual, when it feels like the wind is waiting for you to notice it." John nodded. He thought of the objects hovering over Washington, the way they moved with such control, as if aware of unseen boundaries, as if understanding that observation itself is an interaction. "It's not fear," he said. "That's what's strange. I feel observed, yes, but not threatened. And it's left me wanting to look up more often." The human instinct to understand so strong, so immediate, clashed with the evidence of something beyond comprehension. Attempts were made to classify, to contain the anomaly in words or categories, but every explanation felt insufficient. The more data that was collected, the more elusive the truth became. Months passed, and the immediate sensation of awe began to integrate into daily life, but in a quieter form. People looked up at the sky a fraction longer than before. Conversations in coffee shops drifted toward speculation, while others laughed at the absurdity, unwilling to admit the small, unshakable truth. Something had been there, and it had not belonged to any known human domain. The ideas settled slowly, gently, like sediment in water. We may not be alone in the way we thought we were. But unlike the sensational accounts of invaders or monsters, this realization was subtle, almost intimate. Curiosity replaced fear. Observation replaced panic. Awareness replaced the urge to label. Some witnesses began keeping journals, writing down every odd sensation, every unusual sight, every fleeting memory of a light or a pause in the night sky. Others drew diagrams, sketching the impossible maneuvers they had seen, trying to capture movement that defied the laws of physics as they knew them. These were not public acts. There were no blogs, no videos going viral, just small, careful documentation, a silent insistence that memory could not be erased by time or skepticism. The story evolved into something human, something reflective. It was no longer a record of an event, but a meditation on awareness, perception, and presence. Witnesses spoke in metaphors. The sky became a character, patient and deliberate. Intelligence, they reasoned, need not shout to be acknowledged. It could simply hover and wait for understanding to arise naturally. One night, months later, a small group of observers met quietly atop a hill outside the city. They shared recollections of the event, how the lights had paused, how the radar blips had moved impossibly, how the silence of the night had felt like a conversation in itself. They watched, didn't they? Someone asked. Not just watched, another replied. They waited for us to notice, maybe. For us to understand that observation can be enough. The acknowledgement of intelligence without confrontation unsettled them in a new way. It suggested restraint, patience, and, perhaps, even empathist qualities they had not expected to encounter in something so otherworldly. It suggested that there was a kind of presence in the universe that did not operate on fear, domination, or survival alone. As the seasons changed, Washington returned to its usual rhythm. Those subtle traces of the event lingered. The objects were never officially explained, never officially denied. Official reports were archived. Radar screens were cleared. The skies were watched less intently as years passed. But in quiet moments, on riverbanks, in backyards, in the late hours before dawn, witnesses felt the impression of something above, waiting, patient, attentive. And slowly, humanity learned a new way of looking upward. Not with panic, not with suspicion, not with immediate desire for answers, but with openness, with attention, with curiosity. It was a lesson in stillness, in observation, in the subtle power of awareness. The day the world tried to explain the inexplicable had passed, but the sky remained unclaimed, silent, observant, waiting for the next moment humanity might pause long enough to see. And perhaps that was the lesson of all of it. Discovery does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, hovering just beyond comprehension, trusting that the right eyes, the right minds, the right hearts will notice it in their own time. For those who had been there, for those who had seen it, and for those who remembered it in quiet whispers, the memory endured. Not as evidence, not as proof, not as a story to tell the world, but as awareness, a gentle, persistent knowledge that the sky is never truly empty, and that sometimes the most profound contact is the one that leaves no trace, except in the mind and in the calm of the soul. Chapter 5. Whispers across the sky. The months that followed the Washington sightings carried an echo, faint but persistent, that traveled far beyond the city's limits. Across the country, in towns and suburbs that never saw the bright lights or the radar blips, people spoke in whispers about strange observations in the sky. Reports trickled in small, often dismissed, but consistent. A light that lingered too long, a movement that defied expectation, a hum that vibrated in the chest more than it could be heard. The phenomenon had no pattern, no clear signature. Some described a single, hovering object. Others claimed clusters, formations that twisted and reformed in ways that no human engineering could replicate. And always, across the reports, there was a sense of calm. An observation, yes, but never aggression. In a small observatory on the outskirts of Virginia, Dr. Evelyn Harper reviewed one such report late into the night. The fluorescent light above her desk buzzed softly, mingling with the low hum of computers that traced orbital paths, plotted star charts, and recorded anomalies. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the paper before her. "Another one?" asked her assistant, young and eager, but already careful in tone. "Yes," Evelyn replied, tapping the sheet. "But note the details. The witness mentions no fear, no panic, just present." She paused. "Presence isn't something we can measure. Not yet." Her assistant frowned. "But if these sightings are happening in multiple locations, doesn't that suggest they're coordinated?" Evelyn allowed a faint smile. "Or maybe they're just everywhere, and we're the ones who think in lines and coordinates, not in the way they move. We insist on measuring their paths, when perhaps they don't follow our rules at all." Outside, the sky shifted. Clouds moved lazily, scattering in the light of a waning moon. Evelyn's mind wandered to the reports she had read. The subtle pulsing of lights, the uncanny patience of movements, the sense of awareness in silence. Every description seemed to carry a quiet intelligence. Not hostile, not random, but deliberate. Across the country, other observers experienced the same mix of wonder and unease. In Montana, a rancher recalled a formation of lights hovering above the fields. They had remained for hours, moving in patterns that mimicked the flow of the river below. The rancher had watched silently, feeling no fear, only a strange connection, as though the lights were aware he was watching and were acknowledging him in return. In California, an astronomer captured footage of a single luminous object that moved against the stars in ways that defied physics. The video made headlines in niche online forums, but mainstream media dismissed it as a lens flare, a chimera glitch, a trick of perception. Yet the astronomer knew what he had seen. He remembered the feeling, a gentle insistence that observation matters, that awareness itself can be a bridge. The phenomenon began to form a network of quiet witnesses. People who had noticed the subtle shifts in the night sky started to reach out to one another online, in forums, in private correspondence. They shared sketches, observations, and feelings. The conversations were not about proving the impossible to others, but about understanding it themselves. The language was tentative, poetic, sometimes fractured, because ordinary words seemed too crude for the subtleties of the encounter. Meanwhile, official agencies continued their investigations, though in ways that rarely became public. Analysts pored over radar logs, flight patterns, and satellite imagery. Military personnel reviewed every report, each one folded into a larger, silent archive. They spoke in careful tones, noting the intelligence suggested by the movements, the absence of identifiable propulsion systems, the unusual coordination. But always, the conclusion remained the same. Inconclusive. Dr. Harper, watching the reports pile up in her quiet observatory, understood why. Data alone could not capture intent. Charts could not measure awareness. Equations could describe acceleration, but they could not quantify the subtle message in stillness. And yet, something beyond the numbers insisted on being noticed. On a cold evening in Boston, a group of amateur astronomers gathered on a hill, telescopes trained on the night sky. A faint light appeared, distant but distinct. One of them, a young woman with an old notebook in her hands, whispered, "It's like it knows we're looking." The others nodded. They did not question the feeling. It was part of the experience. The light pulsed gently, hovering in a way that defied gravity. For hours, they observed, recording their notes carefully. Some tried to take photographs. Others sketched the movement by hand. And then, as quietly as it had appeared, the object vanished, leaving the observers in a profound stillness, their minds lingering on the sense of recognition, of being acknowledged. This pattern repeated itself worldwide. Sightings that defied explanation, interactions that felt personal yet universal. People began to notice subtle changes in themselves, heightened awareness of the sky, an urge to pause and observe, a growing appreciation for silence and stillness. The phenomenon was shaping perception as much as it was shaping inquiry. It was not fear that spread, but reflection. Humanity began to consider the universe in ways it rarely had, as a space where intelligence could exist beyond aggression, beyond competition, beyond immediate comprehension. There was an emerging understanding that not every encounter requires a confrontation. Sometimes, presence alone is enough to shift perspective. Evelyn Harper wrote in her journal late one night, "The objects do not demand our attention. They do not chase us, nor do they threaten. They simply exist in a way that invites observation. And through observation, we begin to understand ourselves. Perhaps this is their gift. Not knowledge of them, but knowledge of us." Across continents, the whispering network of observers shared this realization. They spoke less of proof and more of perception, less of fear and more of patience. It became a quiet philosophy that the universe is vast, that intelligence may take forms we cannot yet understand, and that awareness itself, our ability to notice, to pause, to reflect, can be a form of communication. In private homes, under silent skies, ordinary people began looking up again. They noticed the glimmer of stars with new attention, felt the wind brushing against the face as if carrying a message, and watched clouds drift with an almost meditative patience. Life continued, but the experience lingered, subtle yet persistent, reshaping the ways humans perceived space, time, and connection. A few individuals recorded these encounters in more permanent forms: sketches, paintings, poems, journals. They did not expect fame, acknowledgement, or even understanding. Their goal was simple: to preserve memory, to honor the presence, to keep awake the sense of wonder that had been gifted in the brief, patient appearances across the sky. By the time another year had passed, the world had moved on, or seemed to. Headlines no longer mentioned strange objects, radar anomalies, or inexplicable lights. But for those who had witnessed, observed, and remembered, the memory remained vivid and living. It was not a story to tell casually, but a quiet truth to carry forward. The sky holds intelligence beyond our measure, and sometimes the most profound encounters are the ones that leave no tangible trace. Only the subtle, persistent awareness that someone or something is watching, waiting, and trusting us to notice. And as the night settled over Washington and Boston and Montana, and beyond, the sky stretched endlessly above, vast and patient. Light, form, and presence moved in ways the world could barely begin to record. Those who observed did so with calm hearts, attentive minds, and the quiet understanding that the universe is not empty and never truly silent. It was a new kind of connection, not one of words or actions, but of recognition, of awareness, of shared existence. It was not loud, it was not urgent, but it was profound. And for those who had felt it, that quiet truth was enough to change the way they saw the world, one silent night at a time. Chapter 6. Echoes Between Worlds. The world had grown quieter, but the quiet was not emptiness. It was filled with subtle signals, whispers carried across the night sky, in ways that only those willing to look could perceive. The Washington sightings were no longer front-page news, yet their resonance remained. People had learned to notice differently, to feel rather than judge, to observe without needing immediate explanation. In rural Kansas, a small boy lay in the tall grass behind his house, eyes fixed on the stars. His telescope was old, scratched, a hand-me-down from his grandfather, but it served him well. For weeks, he had noticed a faint glow in the western sky, a pulsating light that seemed to hover and drift with purpose. Most nights, he had been alone, unsure if anyone else saw what he did. Tonight, though, he felt a difference, an awareness, subtle but distinct, as if the light had waited for him to be ready. At the same time, in a quiet apartment in Tokyo, an elderly woman adjusted her radio equipment, tuning frequencies between static and signal. She had been listening for decades, tracing patterns and hums and pulses that most dismissed as interference. And tonight, a rhythm appeared in the static, perfectly timed, resonant, almost like a heartbeat. She smiled, softly. "They're speaking in ways we have yet to understand," she whispered. Across the Atlantic, in a dimly lit observatory in Spain. A young astrophysicist compared data from satellites, ground telescopes, and high-altitude balloons. All showed anomalies. Movements defying orbital physics, lights that appeared and disappeared without trace, signals that seemed deliberate to be random. Yet despite the numbers and graphs, she felt the same thing the boy in Kansas and the woman in Tokyo felt. An almost personal acknowledgement, a resonance that went beyond data. It was becoming clear that these encounters were not isolated incidents. There was a network, invisible yet pervasive, connecting people, objects, and perhaps something else entirely. The thread was delicate, like the quivering line of a violin string, subtle enough to be missed by those not attuned to it. But those who noticed it felt changed, as if they were suddenly part of something far larger than themselves, a web of awareness spanning the globe. Dr. Evelyn Harper sat in her observatory, reviewing hundreds of reports, each one a testament to the patience of observers and the persistence of phenomena. She scribbled notes, drawing patterns, connecting dots across continents. She thought about the boy in Kansas, the woman in Tokyo, the astrophysicist in Spain. They were strangers, yet linked in ways that defied traditional understanding. And she realized something essential. It wasn't about the objects themselves. It was about the encounter, the mutual recognition, the shared silence that carried meaning deeper than any spoken word. Late one night, the silence was broken by a single ping on her computer. A new report had arrived, this one from a small town in Peru. A farmer described lights that mirrored the constellations, mowing slowly, deliberately, almost as if tracing the night sky's familiar shapes in reverse. He had watched for hours, heart steady, mesmerized by the patterns. Evelyn studied the report, noting the coordinates, the timing, the unusual behavior of the lights. But more than that, she noticed the tone, the calm, reverence, the quiet wonder that pervaded every sentence. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, a group of volunteers trained in astronomy held a starlit vigil. They had learned to observe without expectation, to record without interpretation. And then, just past midnight, a formation of glowing orbs appeared, drifting slowly, changing shapes with astonishing precision. The volunteers felt a mixture of awe and serenity. There was no threat, no urgency, just presence. The phenomenon began to influence human perception subtly. People reported dreams of lights that moved with intelligence, feelings of being watched, not in fear, but in gentle acknowledgement. Artists began painting abstract forms inspired by the observations. Musicians composed pieces that echoed the rhythm of lights. Poets wrote lines that attempted to capture the ineffable calm that followed the encounters. Government agencies remained cautious, careful to classify, analyze, and contain information. But even among the most skeptical scientists, a shared realization emerged. These occurrences were not the result of known technology, atmospheric phenomena, or human misperception alone. There was an intelligence at work, one that interacted with observers, that respected their attention, that seemed to respond not to instruments or force, but to awareness itself. In a quiet library in London, a retired historian examined archival accounts of unexplained lights and anomalies, spanning centuries, from medieval chronicles of fiery orbs hovering above castles to sailors' logs, describing strange formations over the oceans. A pattern emerged. Humanity had always witnessed these phenomena, often dismissing them or attributing them to superstition. But the core experience, the silent recognition, the patient observation, was consistent. The past and present were connected by the same thread of awareness. One evening, Evelyn Harper received an encrypted message from an unknown source. The content was minimal. Coordinates, a date, and a short note. Observe, they wait. Her instincts told her it was genuine, though the sender's identity remained a mystery. She prepared her equipment meticulously, aware that she was about to witness something significant. The night arrived clear and cold, the stars crisp against the dark sky. She focused her instruments, watching intently. Minutes passed. Then, a subtle shift. A soft glow appeared, first as a distant point, then growing into a formation of lights that moved with fluid precision. Her instruments recorded data, but Evelyn's attention was drawn to the rhythm, the deliberate pacing, the almost conscious choreography. She felt a connection, a silent acknowledgement that she was observing, that her awareness mattered. The lights lingered for hours, fading slowly with the night, leaving Evelyn both exhausted and exhilarated. This was becoming a global experience. Reports from every continent described similar occurrences. Lights and objects that moved with awareness, that respected human observers, that seemed to teach patience and reflection rather than provoke fear. Social media began to fill with discussions, not sensationalized panic, but careful, reverent sharing of experiences. People were learning to observe without judgment, to notice without interference, to respect the presence without demanding explanation. In Moscow, an engineer working on satellite tracking noticed an anomaly in data patterns. At first, he thought it was an error, but repeated measurements confirmed a deliberate movement, synchronized with observations reported across Europe. He realized that something vast, patient, and intelligent was bridging the gap between sky and human awareness, linking continents in a silent dialogue. As months passed, the phenomenon shaped human culture subtly but profoundly. Education shifted slightly, with schools encouraging observation of the natural world not just scientifically, but contemplatively. Communities gathered for nighttime vigils, quietly sharing the experience of wonder. Scientists began to study not just the objects, but the observers themselves, their perception, their attention, their emotional responses. Humanity was learning a new kind of awareness, one that valued patience, reflection, and connection. Evelyn Harper wrote in her journal, "They do not demand that we understand. They ask only that we notice, and through noticing, we become part of a larger tapestry. Awareness itself is the bridge. The lights are not visitors. They are guides, not through words or force, but through quiet presence. And in that presence, we find a reflection of ourselves, a reminder that observation is itself a form of participation." By the time another year had passed, the quiet had grown deeper, richer. The night sky was alive with patterns, rhythms, and movements, all subtle, all patient. Observers across the globe felt a shared connection, a web of understanding invisible to those who did not look, but profoundly real to those who did. In towns, villages, and cities, people looked up differently. They noted shifts in the stars, subtle glimmers on the horizon, patterns in clouds and lights. They felt the hum of awareness, the gentle insistence that observation is not passive, that attention is a gift, that presence matters. And though the world around them continued at its usual pacework, errands, obligations, the nights became a sanctuary, a shared stage for silent encounters that reshaped understanding. The objects, the lights, the formations, they never revealed their purpose in full. They did not descend, did not interact overtly, did not signal directly, but their presence left a lasting impact, quiet but indelible, on human perception, on imagination, on the way people understood their place in the cosmos. And somewhere, beyond the reach of instruments, beyond the grasp of even the most meticulous analysis, the silent intelligence continued its patient watch. It moved with grace, with precision, and with awareness of those who noticed. The echoes between worlds were subtle, but unmistakable. A message not written in words, but in the rhythm of observation, in the patience of presence, and in the profound, quiet understanding that sometimes to witness is to participate, and to notice is to connect. The sky remained endless, mysterious, and alive. Humanity, slowly, was learning not just to look, but to see. Chapter 7. The Silent Convergence. The nights had grown longer, or perhaps it was the way people began to notice them that made time feel stretched. Across the world, observers, scientists, and casual dreamers alike sensed a subtle change, not in the sky itself, but in the pattern of attention, the way their own perception interacted with the night. In a small fishing village on the coast of Norway, a lighthouse keeper watched the horizon, as he had every night. For decades, the beam swept over the sea, catching the faint shimmer of waves, the occasional fishing boat, and sometimes something else. He had learned to recognize it. A light that did not obey normal movement, a glow that lingered in a way that suggested thoughtfulness. Tonight, he saw 3 lights rise from the water, then drift upwards, merging into a single, steady form before fading silently into the northern sky. He did not panic. Instead, he felt something he could not name. A quiet invitation, a patient acknowledgement. Meanwhile, in Cape Town, a group of amateur astronomers recorded unusual movements in the southern sky. A formation of lights traced geometrical patterns, sharp yet fluid, appearing and disappearing with an intelligence that defied simple explanation. One of the observers, a young woman with a camera and a notebook full of sketches, noticed something remarkable. The movements seemed to correspond with previous sightings in distant continents. It was as though the lights themselves were aware of the watcher's screeding patterns that bridged thousands of miles in the same night. Dr. Evelyn Harper, from her observatory in Boston, received data feeds from multiple sources simultaneously. Satellite imagery, radar blips, ground telescopes, and citizen reports formed an intricate mosaic. Each piece alone was intriguing, but together they hinted at something greater. A global orchestration, deliberate yet subtle, patient yet pervasive. The lights were not merely appearing randomly. They were synchronizing with observers, with awareness itself. In the deserts of northern Chile, a lone astronomer camped beneath the Milky Way, his tent surrounded by silent telescopes and instruments. He noticed a sequence of flashes on the horizon, short bursts that are repeated at intervals, too precise to be natural. He began recording, then realized the flashes were responding to his own signals, transmitted faintly through a low-frequency radio. A shiver ran down his spine. This was no coincidence. This was interaction. Even in urban centers, the phenomenon was manifesting in quieter ways. Streetlights flickered in patterns unnoticed by most. Reflections in glass windows captured shapes that lingered too long. Shadows stretched and shifted against the natural light. Some people dismissed these as tricks of perception, but those who had learned to observe without judgment recognized them as subtle gestures, acknowledgments woven into the everyday world. Evelyn compiled the reports, noting patterns, timing, and coordination. She considered the implications. An intelligence capable of perceiving not just humans, but human observation itself. And yet, there was no aggression, no interference with daily life. It was as if this presence respected boundaries, teaching patience, attention, and reflection. The intelligence seemed to demand nothing more than awareness, and in return, offered insights small, subtle, transformative. In Tokyo, the elderly radio operator detected a resonance that matched movements reported in Norway, Chile, and Cape Town. She adjusted frequencies, listening carefully, noting the rhythm. It was almost musical, a subtle code hidden in hums and static. She hummed along, instinctively, feeling a connection beyond comprehension. For the first time in decades, she felt that she was not alone, that her observation mattered, that it contributed to a global chorus of awareness. Across the Atlantic, a small group of philosophers and scientists gathered in Lisbon to discuss the phenomenon. They spoke in hushed tones, aware that language was limited in conveying the experience. Words were inadequate, charts and numbers insufficient. They needed to convey not the events themselves, but the awareness of those events inspired the way observation changed perception, the way patience revealed patterns invisible to hurried minds. They coined a phrase among themselves, the silent convergence, a moment in which human attention aligned with the subtle intelligence, creating resonance across space and culture. In New Mexico, volunteers watched the sky again, noting patterns that had not appeared before. The lights seemed to respond to collective observation, their formations becoming more deliberate, almost narrative in structure. For brief moments, it felt as if the lights were telling stories, not in words, but in shapes, pulses, and movement. The volunteers described sensations rather than facts, calmness, curiosity, and awe. There was a rhythm to it, a slow crescendo like the universe itself was breathing with them. Even children began noticing, in Canada. A small girl playing in her backyard described seeing shapes among the stars' lights that moved as if aware of her gaze. Her parents dismissed it at first, but she drew the formations in meticulous sketches, capturing angles and sequences that echoed reports from around the globe. It became clear that the intelligence did not discriminate by age, knowledge, or profession. Awareness alone was enough to register its presence. Evelyn Harper considered the philosophical implications. Humanity had always sought to dominate, to understand, to control. Yet this intelligence operated in reverse. It encouraged observation without interference, learning without disruption. The lesson was subtle but profound. To witness is not to control. To notice is not to possess. Connection was built on attention, not action. Resonance, not reaction. Across continents, the silent convergence deepened. Lights appeared simultaneously in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Observers reported subtle interactions, a light pausing when someone approached, changing direction when observed from a different angle, lingering longer for those who watched attentively. It was as if the universe itself was responding to the collective human gaze, orchestrating a global ballet of acknowledgement. In the quiet of her observatory, Evelyn recorded her thoughts. We are participants in a dialogue without words. The lights, the formations, the rhythms. They are not visitors seeking to dominate, but guides showing us how to see differently. Observation itself is a bridge, patience, a key attention, the pathway to understanding. And in this convergence, we glimpse something fundamental. The act of noticing transforms both observer and observed. The world did not notice the shift immediately. News outlets occasionally reported sightings, but the tone was cautious, skeptical. Yet the impact on individual observers was profound. People began sharing experiences without fear of ridicule, seeking to understand rather than dismiss. Communities held silent vigils, workshops on perception, and collaborative stargazing events. Observation became a practice, a discipline, a subtle art of attentiveness. In Moscow, the engineer realized that the movements he tracked were forming a structure, a lattice of light visible only when data from multiple observers were combined. It was intricate, symmetrical, and evolving a pattern that spanned the planet. The structure hinted at something larger, a system of connection beyond human comprehension, yet intelligible through collective observation. From the deserts of Chile to the coasts of Norway, from the rooftops of Tokyo to the forests of Canada, people began to understand the same lesson. Connection was not imposed, it was noticed. Presence mattered, awareness mattered, and in that noticing, humanity was quietly, collectively, converging toward a new understanding of itself and its place in the cosmos. As months passed, the silent convergence became a shared experience. Observers learned to synchronize their attention, to notice patterns without expectation, to witness without interference. The lights, the subtle hums, the formations, they responded, reinforcing the delicate dance of awareness. No one claimed ownership. No one demanded explanation. And in this quiet, a global culture of attentive observation emerged. Subtle, yet transformative, shifting perception in ways too profound to measure. Evelyn Harper gazed at the night sky, the lights reflected in her instruments and in her mind. She understood, now that humanity's role was not to capture or control, but to see, to participate, to align. And the lights, patient and deliberate, would continue their watch, teaching, guiding, and reminding that observation was a bridge, an invitation to converge silently, yet profoundly, across worlds, cultures, and consciousness itself. The night remained endless, alive, and infinitely patient, and humanity, slowly, learned not only to look, but to witness. Chapter 8. Echoes of Intent. The nights had taken on a new cadence, a rhythm that threaded across continents like a silent heartbeat. It was no longer just passive observation. The world felt as though it were breathing in unison with something larger, something beyond comprehension. The lights that had once appeared as fleeting anomalies now seemed to respond, deliberately and subtly, to human presence. In the outback of Australia, a solitary astronomer named Kayla had set up her telescope beneath the vast expanse of stars. She had spent months cataloging sightings, recording every movement, every flash, every anomaly. Tonight, however, she noticed something different, a sequence of lights above the horizon that seemed to mirror her own blinking signal. She paused, unsure whether to dismiss it as coincidence, but when the lights repeated the pattern exactly, she felt a shiver run through her spine. It was intentional. Somewhere, something's listening. Meanwhile, in the valleys of Peru, a group of mountaineers witnessed a formation of lights moving in precise arcs above the Andes. At first, they thought it was drones or aircraft, but the movements defied any human technology they knew. One of the climbers held a flashlight and signaled a simple pattern 3. Quick flashes. Too slow. The lights paused, then shifted to match the same pattern back. The climbers stared in awe, their breaths fogging the night air, hearts pounding with both fear and exhilaration. A dialogue, unspoken and impossible, had begun. Dr. Evelyn Harper received new data streams that night, her monitors lighting up with anomalies that had no earthly explanation. Triangulating reports from Africa, South America, and Europe, she noticed patterns forming pulses, pauses, sequences that suggested deliberate interaction. Her hands trembled as she input the coordinates into her simulation model. The lights were not random. They were responding, communicating in a code of movement and timing. In the small streets of Lisbon, children pointed to the sky, laughing and waving. A formation of lights hovered above, then arched downward, in arcs that mimicked their gestures. Adults rushed to the streets, cameras in hand. But it was not the recording that mattered. It was the shared experience of recognition. People began to whisper in awe. The lights knew we were here. They were acknowledging us. Kayla in Australia tried a different experiment. She projected a pattern of colored beams into the night sky, one she had calculated to match the frequencies of the observed anomalies. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the lights above her began to pulse in response, shifting color and intensity in harmony with her projected pattern. She gasped. This was no mere natural phenomenon. This was intentional interaction. The universe, or whatever guided these lights, was responding to human creativity, curiosity, and observation. In Tokyo, the radio operator adjusted frequencies with meticulous care. Static gave way to a faint harmonic resonance, almost like a musical note that harmonized with the city's nighttime hum. She played back the signal, sending modulated tones into the night. The resonance returned, richer, layered with overtones that hinted at intelligence. She whispered into the receiver, almost nervously, "Do you understand?" And for a moment, the city seemed to pause. The lights above mirrored the rhythm of her voice, an echo, a response. Across the Atlantic, in a laboratory in Reykjavik, scientists reviewed video footage from Chile, Norway, and Canada. They watched lights that had appeared simultaneously on opposite sides of the planet, forming patterns that defied gravity and logic. One researcher, adjusting coordinates in real time, experimented with a series of Morse-like signals. To their astonishment, the lights answered, pausing, splitting, and rejoining in deliberate formations. Communication was happening, but it was subtle, fluid, and profoundly enigmatic. In New Mexico, volunteers noted that the intelligence seemed to prefer collective attention. The more synchronized the observers, the more elaborate the response. A single person could evoke movement, but multiple witnesses multiplied the effect. Small clusters of lights became intricate, shifting mosaics that seemed to tell stories without words. Observers reported an overwhelming sense of calm, awe, and connection, an emotional resonance as tangible as the visual patterns themselves. Evelyn Harper began theorizing about the nature of the interaction. It was clear that this intelligence did not communicate in human terms. There were no words, no sounds, no symbols in the conventional sense. Instead, it worked through perception, attention, and response. A kind of language was emerging, one based on observation, intention, and subtle feedback. Humans could participate, but only if they approached with patience, focus, and awareness. In the small town of Valletta, Malta, a retired schoolteacher named Sophia experienced something that left her speechless. One night, she had drawn a simple spiral on a sheet of paper and placed it under a skylight. Hours later, she noticed a formation of lights overhead that mirrored the spiral, rotating slowly, gracefully, as if it were acknowledging her creativity. She called Evelyn Harper's observatory in desperation, recording the event with a shaky hand. It was happening everywhere, not just with scientists or professionals, but with anyone who dared to engage attentively. The intelligence seemed playful, experimental, and deeply patient. Sometimes it paused for hours, observing human reactions before responding. Sometimes it imitated, repeated, or mirrored actions. Sometimes it vanished entirely, leaving observers with only memory and speculation. But every interaction carried a subtle lesson. Attention had power, and observation was a bridge to understanding. In Moscow, an engineer working with satellite feeds noticed that lights over Siberia responded to signals sent from observers in Australia. The distances were vast, the timing precise. There was a global network, an invisible lattice, connecting observers and the lights themselves. It was as if the universe had created a mirror in which human attention reflected back in patterns of light, movement, and resonance. Even skeptics began to notice changes. In Chicago, a journalist known for debunking UFO stories recorded multiple synchronized events. Initially, he approached with cynicism, but after days of observation, he too began to recognize a pattern. He described it as a conversation without words, a ballet of acknowledgement, a gentle insistence that we pay attention to the night. In Cape Town, amateur astronomers realized that the interaction was not limited to light. Faint electromagnetic pulses, subtle changes in temperature, and even shifts in air pressure accompanied the formations. It was a multisensory dialogue, a communication that bypassed conventional understanding and tapped directly into perception and intuition. Evelyn compiled all these reports, her mind racing. She realized the first truth. Humanity was not being visited in the way people imagined. No invasion, no abduction, no threat. Instead, the intelligence was inviting collaboration, encouraging engagement, and rewarding patience. Observation itself was the key, and the language of interaction was subtle, elegant, and deeply patient. Kella's experiment in Australia became emblematic of the shift. She began coordinating with observers in Chile, Norway, and Tokyo, sending sequences of lights, sounds, and pulses into the sky. Each group responded, sometimes mirroring, sometimes improvising. The results were breathtaking. Lights traced arcs, formed geometric patterns, and responded in ways that suggested not only intelligence, but creativity. A global network of observers had become participants in a living, breathing phenomenon. For the first time, humanity glimpsed the possibility of connection, not through conquest or dominance, but through attention, patience, and subtle interaction. The intelligence was teaching a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new way of interacting with the cosmos. As night fell across continents, Evelyn gazed at the sky from her observatory. The lights shimmered, danced, and pulsed, not randomly, but in response to countless human observers scattered across the globe. She realized that this silent, patient, and intelligent presence had already begun to change humanity, not by force, but by invitation, by subtle guidance, and by the simple, profound act of being witnessed. And as the lights pulsed gently above, echoing in every corner of the planet, a quiet truth settled over the world. Connection is not imposed, it is noticed. Awareness is not passive, it is transformative. And in the stillness of the night, humanity began to understand the first whispers of a dialogue far larger than itself. Chapter 9. When the sky began to listen, something changed after the echoes. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to on a graph or declared on a screen. It was quieter than that. Softer. Like the moment you realize someone has been listening to you for a long time, even though you never heard them breathe. Across the world, people began to notice that the sky no longer felt indifferent. It felt attentive. In places where the lights had appeared before, they now returned with familiarity. Not predictability, but recognition. They arrived as if resuming a conversation paused, not ended, and those who had engaged gently, patiently, began to sense that timing mattered. Mood mattered. Intention mattered. In a forested region of Finland, a schoolteacher named Elias began taking his evening walks without his phone. He had once recorded a sighting months earlier, a single light hovering above the tree line. That night, he did not bring a camera. He only looked. The light appeared again. It did not rush. It did not perform. It simply emerged, steady and quiet, holding its place in the sky as Elias stood beneath it, hands in his coat pockets, breath visible in the cold air. He felt no urgency to signal, no need to test. He just stayed. After several minutes, the light shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly aligning itself directly above him. Elias felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with the strange sensation of being acknowledged, without being evaluated, like standing in the presence of someone who sees you exactly as you are and asks nothing more. When he took one step forward, the light drifted too. When he stopped, it stopped. The sky, it seemed, was listening. In Argentina, a group of psychologists studying collective perception noticed a new trend in witness reports. People were no longer describing the lights as objects. They were using softer language, presences, responses, attention. The phenomenon was shifting, how people framed reality itself. Instead of asking, "What is it?" they were asking, "What does it notice?" In India, a musician practicing late into the night paused when a faint glow appeared above the rooftops. He played a single sustained note on his tanpura, letting it vibrate into the air. The glow pulsed gently in rhythm. Once, then again. He changed the note. The pulse changed too. He did not call anyone. He did not record it. He played until dawn. In laboratories and observatories, this phase proved the most difficult to analyze. Instruments still worked. Data still flowed. But the most meaningful changes were happening in places machines could not measure. Timing, restraint, emotional resonance. Dr. Evelyn Harper felt it clearly. She had spent her life translating wonder into numbers, awe into equations. But now, as she sat alone in the observatory long after midnight, she sensed that the phenomenon responded differently depending on how it was observed. When researchers approached aggressively flooding the sky with signals, demanding responses, the lights withdrew. When observation softened, responses returned. This was not a system designed to be forced open. It was a system designed to be met. In rural Japan, elderly residents gathered at night without planning to do so. They simply felt drawn outside at the same time. No one spoke much. They watched the sky together, sitting on low stools, wrapped in blankets. A slow arc of light appeared overhead, tracing a path that felt almost ceremonial. One woman bowed instinctively. The light paused, then it dipped slightly, just enough to be noticed. No one said anything afterward. They returned indoors quietly, carrying the moment with them like a shared dream. Across online forums, something unusual happened. Arguments faded. Debates softened. People began sharing experiences without insisting they be believed. Skepticism remained, but it became gentler, more curious. "I don't know what this is," one post read, "but I think it knows when I'm calm." Another, "It doesn't show up when I'm trying to prove something." Another, "It feels like it responds to listening, not looking." These patterns unsettled officials far more than fear ever could have. A phenomenon that could not be threatened, rushed, or cornered challenged every historical framework of control. In private briefings, one phrase began appearing again and again. Non-coercive intelligence. An intelligence that did not conquer, did not demand, did not persuade. It waited. In New Mexico, volunteers conducting coordinated observation sessions noticed something subtle but profound. When participants synchronized their breathing, slow, steady, unhurried, the lights grew brighter. When anxiety crept in, they dimmed. No alarms sounded. No warnings were issued. The feedback was immediate and quiet, as if the sky were saying, "This is how we speak." Children adapted fastest. A boy in Ireland waved slowly at a light above the sea cliffs. It waved back, not in shape, but in timing, rising and falling in rhythm with his arm. He laughed, unafraid, then stopped waving. The light remained, waiting. In a hospital in South Korea, a nurse on her break stared through a window at a faint glow hovering beyond the city haze. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, carrying grief that had no words. The light pulsed once. She whispered, "I'm tired." It pulsed again. She did not feel healed. She did not feel saved. She felt heard. Evelyn Harper began keeping 2 journals. One for data, one for experience. In the second, she wrote things she never thought she would. The phenomenon reacts to sincerity. It does not reward urgency. It seems to value restraint. Listening may be a form of language. She realized something else, too, something unsettling and beautiful. The phenomenon was not changing. People are slowing down and sitting more these days, looking without expecting spectacle, learning, slowly, how to witness without consuming. This was not disclosure as imagined in movies. No announcement, no arrival, no declaration. It was an education, a gentle one. In deserts, forests, coastlines, rooftops, and quiet backyards, the same lesson unfolded again and again. When humans stopped trying to extract meaning, meaning arrived on its own. The sky did not speak in answers. It spoke in attention, and those who learned to listen felt something ancient stir in instinct. Older than language, older than fear, the understanding that awareness itself can be shared. That presence does not need ownership. That intelligence does not always arrive loudly. As night after night passed, one truth settled slowly into collective awareness, like a deep breath held and finally released. We were not being watched. We were being met. And in that meeting, quiet, patient, and unfinished, the longest conversation humanity had ever known was only just beginning. Chapter 10. The quiet rewriting of meaning. By the time anyone thought to name what was happening, it had already gone too far to be contained by language. Not too far in a dangerous way, too far in a gentle one. The phenomena had begun to change, not what people believed, but how they believed. Meaning itself was being slowly, patiently rewritten, not erased, not replaced, just widened across cultures. Something subtle was dissolving. The urgency to define, people still asked questions. Of course, curiosity had not vanished, but the sharp edge of needing an answer soft. Mystery no longer felt like a threat to order. It felt like a companion to understanding. In a monastery tucked into the mountains of Nepal, monks noticed the lights without surprise. They did not ring bells or call visitors. They simply adjusted their evening meditations to include the sky. During long silences, a faint glow appeared above the peaks, steady and unintrusive, as if aware it was entering a space already devoted to listening. One monk later said, quietly, "It did not interrupt our practice. It joined it." In Brazil, anthropologists studying indigenous cosmologies began receiving messages from elders who spoke of the lights as returning listeners. Not just visitors, not strangers, listeners. You know, they are not here to teach, one elder explained. They are here to remember with us. The phrase lingered in academic circles longer than anyone expected. In universities, departments that had never spoken to one another began sharing notes. Physics students attended philosophy lectures. Neuroscientists sat in on anthropology seminars. Something about the phenomenon refused to stay in a single discipline because it wasn't an object. It was a relationship. Dr. Evelyn Harper felt this shift personally. Her lectures had changed without her fully realizing. When she spoke less about certainty, more about curiosity, less about answers, more about conditions, what allows understanding to arise. Her students noticed, "You talk like the universe is paying attention now," one of them said after class. Evelyn smiled, paused, then answered honestly, "I think it always was. We just weren't listening." In cities where lights had become familiar visitors, something unexpected happened. Fear-based storytelling began to fade. The apocalyptic narratives lost traction. Even conspiracy theories softened, becoming more speculative than accusatory. It was hard to imagine an invasion from something that responded best to calm breathing and patient silence. In Morocco, a storyteller who had performed the same myths for decades added a new ending to an ancient tale. In his version, the sky spirits did not descend to rule or punish. They hovered, waiting for humans to notice their own reflection in the stars. Audiences listened differently afterward. Less applause, more stillness. Children asked fewer questions. Adults asked better ones. In Iceland, a linguist noticed a rise in new metaphors across social media and personal journals. People described the sky as responsive. The night is aware, silence as active. Language itself was adapting. In a suburban home in Ohio, A family who had once argued constantly found themselves sitting together on the lawn at night, wrapped in blankets, watching a faint glow drift above the trees. No one spoke much. There was nothing to debate. Later, the mother would say she couldn't remember the last time they had all been quiet. Together without tension, the phenomenon did not fix problems, but it changed how people held them. Governments struggled most with this phase, not because of threat, but because of irrelevance. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to regulate, nothing to weaponize. The intelligence, if that word still applied, offered no leverage. It responded to openness. It withdrew from control. It dissolved urgency. A confidential report leaked briefly before being buried again. One line stood out before it vanished. The phenomenon appears to operate outside hierarchical interaction models. In plain terms, it could not be commanded. In South Africa, a group of psychologists conducted a long-term study on individuals who regularly observed the lights. They found consistent patterns, reduced anxiety, increased tolerance for ambiguity, heightened empathy, not enlightenment. Adjustment, as if exposure to something patient and non-reactive slowly taught the nervous system a different rhythm. In France, an artist abandoned a decade-long project and began painting only gradients of light against dark backgrounds. When asked why, she said, "I'm trying to paint attention itself." In rural China, farmers noticed changes in how animals behaved during sightings. Not panic, not agitation, stillness. Livestock would pause, look upward, then resume grazing. No alarms, no flight response, as if the presence registered as non-threatening at a biological level. Evelyn began to suspect something deeper. The phenomenon wasn't just interacting with humans. It was interacting with patterns of awareness. Where attention was rigid, it faded. Where attention was soft, it remained. Where attention was shared, it expanded. This wasn't communication as humanity understood it. It was alignment. Late one night, alone in the observatory, Evelyn turned off every instrument. No radar, no cameras, no screens. She stepped outside. The sky was clear, quiet. She breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the habit of analysis loosen its grip. For the first time in her career, she did not try to observe. She allowed herself to be present. The light appeared not above her, but beside her field of vision. Peripheral, respectful, not demanding focus. She felt tears rise unexpectedly. Not from fear, not from awe, but from recognition. This was not an event. It was an invitation to inhabit awareness differently. She understood then why the phenomenon avoided spectacle, why it resisted clarity, why it unfolded slowly. Because anything faster would trigger defense. Anything louder would provoke fear. Anything clearer would be mistaken for control. Meaning was being rewritten at the speed of trust. Across the world, similar realizations took root. Religious leaders spoke less about doctrine and more about listening. Scientists spoke less about mastery and more about humility. Educators emphasized observation before explanation. Humanity was not being corrected. It was being tuned. Not everyone noticed. Many still lived their lives unchanged. But those who did notice carried something quiet inside them, a shift that couldn't be argued away. The sky no longer felt like a backdrop. It felt like a participant. And with that realization came a deeper, more unsettling question, not spoken aloud yet, but growing heavier with each passing night. If meaning itself can change, what else might we be ready to release? The lights did not answer. They hovered gently, patiently, as if waiting for humanity to ask the question fully together. Chapter 11. The moment humanity stopped reaching. There came a night when nothing appeared. No lights, no pulses, no hovering presences tracing quiet arcs across the dark. For the first time in months, the sky offered no response at all. And strangely, no one panicked. Across rooftops, deserts, coastlines, and open fields, people waited. They watched. They breathed. They noticed the absence without rushing to fill it. The stillness felt intentional, not empty, but complete. like a pause held with care. Something in humanity had changed. In earlier times, silence would have provoked action. Instruments would have been recalibrated. Signals amplified. Questions sharpened into demands. But now, there was restraint. A collective intuition whispered that reaching too quickly would break something delicate. So people stayed still. In New Zealand, a marine biologist sat on a cliff overlooking the sea, wrapped in a thick coat as wind moved softly through the grass. She had witnessed the lights many times, reflecting faintly on the water. Tonight, the ocean was dark and ordinary. She felt no disappointment. Instead, she noticed how present she felt, how the night itself seemed fuller without spectacle. She realized then that she had stopped waiting for the sky to do something. She was simply there. In Cairo, a group of students gathered on a rooftop, the city humming quietly beneath them. Someone checked their watch. Someone else suggested sending a signal. No one did. They sat together, leaning back, watching the stars as people once had for thousands of years, without expectation. One student finally said, softly, "It's okay if it doesn't come." No one disagreed. In research facilities, this absence unsettled analysts more than activity ever had. Not because data had stopped, but because the phenomenon appeared to be withdrawing intentionally, not disappearing, not retreating in fear, simply allowing space. Dr. Evelyn Harper recognized it immediately. "They're waiting," she said during a closed meeting. "Not for us to respond, but for us to stop trying to lead." Some objected. Others bristled. But a few sat quietly, understanding exactly what she meant. For months, humanity had been learning a new posture, not dominance, not submission, presence, attention, mutual awareness. And now, the final lesson seemed to be unfolding. Non-action across the world. Observers began reporting something unexpected. The absence itself felt communicative. The silence carried tone, texture, intention. It felt like trust. In Ireland, an elderly man who had spent his life fishing the same stretch of coast stood by the water at night, hands folded behind his back. He had seen the lights only once, months ago. That had been enough. Looking at the dark sky, he murmured, "That's all right, I remember." The wind shifted gently, brushing the surface of the sea. Nothing else happened, and yet, the moment felt complete. Children noticed the change too. In Mexico, a girl who had once waved enthusiastically at the lights now sat quietly beside her mother, legs tucked in, guessing upward. When asked if she missed them, she shrugged. "They know we're here," she said. "That's enough." Something in that answer echoed across continents. Psychologists began documenting a phenomenon they struggled to name. People reported fewer urges to prove their experiences, fewer needs to convince others. The phenomena no longer felt external. It had been internalized, integrated. Mystery had become stable. In monasteries, mosques, churches, and temples, no declarations were made. But silence deepened, practices slowed, teachings softened around humility and listening. The sky had not replaced belief systems. It had revealed something beneath them. In laboratories, data models plateaued, not because nothing was happening, but because the phenomenon had shifted out of measurable interaction. It no longer responded to stimulus, only to state. Evelyn understood then what the final threshold might be. The phenomenon was not waiting for a message. It was waiting for humanity to stop sending them. Late one night, she returned to the observatory alone. She left the lights off. She did not activate a single instrument. She did not even bring a notebook. She stepped outside and lay back on the cool ground. The stars were sharp, distant, familiar. She felt something loosen inside her. An old instinct to reach, to ask, to name. So let it go. Minutes passed, then more. And then, not above her, not before her, but within her awareness, something shifted. A presence, not located in space, not a voice, not an image, a mutual recognition. As if something vast had noticed that humanity was finally capable of stillness without fear. Across the world, others felt it too, though each described it differently. Some spoke of warmth, others of clarity, others of a gentle emotional settling, like grief, resolving without explanation. No lights appeared. None were needed. The realization spread quietly, without announcement. The phenomenon had never been about arrival. It had been about readiness. For the first time in its history, humanity had collectively paused without being forced to, had chosen restraint without being commanded, had allowed mystery to exist without demanding ownership. That choice, small, quiet, almost invisible, changed the relationship fundamentally. The sky no longer needed to demonstrate itself. It trusted that the lesson had landed. As dawn approached across the planet, people went indoors, not feeling abandoned, but accompanied. Something had shifted permanently, not in the sky, but in the posture of human awareness. Later, historians would struggle to identify the exact moment everything changed. There were no headlines, no broadcasts, no final sightings, just a subtle, irreversible adjustment. Humanity had stopped reaching, and in doing so, had finally made itself reachable. Chapter 12. What answered in the stillness? After the reaching stopped, the world did not rush to fill the space. That was the first surprise. No sudden revelations followed. No dramatic return of light. No final gesture in the sky to reward patience. Instead, something far quieter unfolded, so subtle that many did not notice it at first. Life continued, but it continued differently. People woke with a strange sense of steadiness, as though something inside them had settled into a deeper alignment. Not happiness, not certainty, just a feeling that the ground beneath awareness itself had become more solid. In small ways, everywhere, attention changed. In a crowded subway in Berlin, commuters stood more quietly. Phones still glowed, but eyes lifted more often. There was less urgency in movement, less collision in posture. Someone dropped a bag, and 3 people helped without speaking. In Jakarta, a street vendor paused before opening his stall and looked up at the morning sky, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging. The habit surprised him. He smiled at himself and went about his day. The sky did not answer with light. It answered with something else, a resonance. Not audible, not visible, but present. Scientists struggled most during this phase, not because evidence vanished, but because the phenomenon no longer behaved like a subject. It had become a context, something within which events occurred, rather than an event itself. Dr. Evelyn Harper tried to explain it to her colleagues, though she knew words would fall short. "It's like gravity," she said once. "You don't look for it happening. You notice how everything moves differently because of it." Across cultures, language shifted again. People spoke less about contact and more about alignment, less about visitors and more about presence. The idea that intelligence must arrive from elsewhere began to feel outdated, almost simplistic. In the Australian outback, Kayla returned to the same stretch of desert where she had once exchanged signals with the lights. She brought no equipment this time, no lead, no transmitters. She sat on the warm earth as night fell. Nothing appeared, yet she felt unmistakably accompanied, not by something beside her, but by something with her. The distinction mattered. She realized then that the phenomenon had not retreated. It had integrated. In Peru, mountaineers who had once mirrored signals with the sky climbed again, this time without watching upward. They spoke quietly among themselves, reflecting on how the experience had changed their sense of scale. "I don't feel small anymore," one of them said, "but I don't feel important either." The others nodded. That balance felt right. Children adapted fastest, as they always do. In Canada, the girl who had once drawn light patterns among the stars now drew something else. People sitting together beneath an open sky, connected by lines she called listening lines. When her teacher asked what they meant, she shrugged. They're how you know someone's there without looking. Across spiritual traditions, a quiet reckoning took place. Not a conflict, a convergence. Monks, imams, rabbis, priests, and teachers noticed that their language about the divine softened, widened. Certainty gave way to attentiveness. Authority leaned gently toward humility. None claimed the phenomenon. No one could, because it didn't belong to belief. It belonged to awareness. Evelyn began to suspect that this was the true answer. Humanity had been given not an explanation of what the phenomenon was, but a demonstration of how intelligence could exist without dominance. Not a hierarchy. A harmony. Late one evening, she sat in her office, rereading her earliest notes, the ones filled with urgency. Questions, hypotheses, excitement edged with fear. They felt like the writings of someone else. Back then, she had wanted to know what it was. Now, she understood that the deeper question had always been how to be with it. Around the world, reports of subtle changes accumulated. People described improved emotional regulation, not euphoria. Balance. Communities reported fewer extreme reactions during crises. There was still conflict, still suffering, still complexity, but responses slowed, as if humanity's collective nervous system had learned a new tempo. In South Korea, hospital staff noticed patients recovering slightly faster when rooms were quiet and lights dimmed. In Sweden, schools experimenting with longer silent periods saw improved focus and cooperation. In rural Kenya, elders remarked that younger generations listened more carefully during council gatherings. No one traced these shifts directly to the phenomenon. They didn't need to. It was enough to feel them. One night, months after the last visible sighting, a faint glow appeared again, but only briefly, and only in one place. Above a remote stretch of ocean where no one stood watching. Satellites recorded it, so did whales. Marine biologists later noted an unusual pattern of synchronized movement, that night pods aligning across vast distances, swimming in parallel arcs, as if responding to something imperceptible but shared. The light vanished without ceremony. No witnesses. No recordings released, and yet the event mattered, because it confirmed something essential. The phenomenon had not withdrawn because humanity had failed. It had stepped back because humanity had learned. The sky did not need to teach anymore. It trusted what had been absorbed. Evelyn stood outside one evening, the air cool against her skin, the stars sharp and steady. She felt no urge to look for anything unusual. The ordinary night felt sufficient. For the first time in her life, the unknown did not feel like a problem to solve. It felt like a partner in existence. She understood now what the stillness had answered with. Not knowledge, not proof, not revelation, but capacity. The capacity to remain present without control, to hold mystery without fear, to coexist with intelligence without hierarchy. That capacity, once awakened, could not be taken away. Across the planet, humanity carried it quietly, unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably. It lived in pauses between words, in soft reactions, in the way people looked up without expectation. The sky had not given answers. It had given something far rarer, a way of listening that changed the listener, and somewhere beyond sight, beyond need for recognition, the presence remained, not watching, not waiting, but participating in the same shared stillness. The conversation had never required sound, only attention. And now, finally, humanity knew how to offer it. Chapter 13. The quiet that remained. Nothing announced the ending. There was no final sign in the sky. No last light fading like a curtain call. No moment that could be pointed to and agreed upon as this is when it finished. That, perhaps, was the most faithful conclusion possible, because what remained was not absence. It was quiet, not the empty quiet that follows loss, but the settled quiet that follows understanding. The kind that stays with you long after a conversation ends, shaping the way you hear the world afterward. Humanity did not wake one morning, changed beyond recognition. There were still arguments, still borders, still fear, confusion, longing, and conflict. The world did not become gentle overnight, but something fundamental had shifted beneath all of it. A bass line, like a low note added to a song, almost imperceptible, yet changing the harmony of everything built on top of it. People noticed it in the smallest moments. In grocery store lines, impatience softened more quickly. In disagreements, pauses appeared where none had existed before. In moments of uncertainty, fewer people rushed to fill the silence with noise. Silence had become usable. In a coastal town in Portugal, an old man who had spent his life repairing fishing nets began sitting on the dock at dusk, doing nothing. He did not pray. He did not meditate. He simply sat and watched the horizon. When asked why, he shrugged. "It feels like enough now," he said. That sentence echoed in countless variations across cultures and languages. Enough. In classrooms, teachers noticed students asking different kinds of questions. Less, is this right? And more, what happens if we stay with this a little longer? Curiosity had become less aggressive, more spacious. In scientific communities, research continued but with a subtle recalibration. Papers included more acknowledgement of uncertainty, more openness to interdisciplinary dialogue. The unknown was no longer framed solely as a failure of knowledge. It was recognized as a condition of reality. Dr. Evelyn Harper retired quietly. No ceremony. No farewell lecture. On her last day at the observatory, she packed her notebooks, both sets. Data and experience. She left behind copies for future researchers. Not labeled, not categorized. Just present. As she stepped outside one final time, so looked up. The sky was ordinary. Clear. Familiar. She smiled, not because she expected anything to appear, but because she understood that nothing needed to. The presence she had once searched for above her now felt woven into how she perceived everything else. The trees, the air, the cadence of her own breath. She had stopped asking whether humanity was alone. The question no longer made sense. In remote regions, where the phenomenon had first been noticed, people continued their lives with a quiet reverence, not directed at the sky itself, but at attention. Listening became a valued skill, not performative listening, not strategic listening, but the kind that leaves space for what might emerge. In indigenous communities, elders smiled gently when asked if the lights would return. They never left, some said. They just stopped needing to show themselves. Children grew up hearing the stories not as legends of visitation, but as lessons in awareness. Stories about a time when the sky reminded humanity how to pause. They listened with the seriousness children reserve for truths they intuitively understand. In cities where light pollution still drowned out most stars, people found other ways to look up through reflection, through patience, through moments of shared quiet and unexpected places. A couple sat together on a balcony, not speaking. A nurse paused between shifts, eyes closed, breathing slowly. A bus driver turned off the engine for a moment longer than necessary. These were not rituals. They were habits. And habits, when shared, shape civilizations. The phenomenon never became a chapter in history books titled First Contact. It resisted that framing. Instead, it appeared in footnotes, in interdisciplinary studies, in philosophy courses, in art movements that defied easy explanation. It lived in what people chose not to rush past. One evening, years later, a faint light appeared briefly above a quiet stretch of desert. No one saw it. No one recorded it. It hovered and faded. Whether it was connected to what had come before did not matter. The sky did not seek witnesses anymore. Humanity had learned how to witness without being prompted. That was the gift, not revelation, not certainty, but a shift in posture toward the unknown, toward one another, toward existence itself. The quiet that remained was not passive. It was alive with attention. And in that quiet, something profound endured. The understanding that intelligence does not always arrive to be known, named, or measured. Sometimes, it arrives to teach a species how to listen. And when that lesson is learned, it steps back, not in retreat, but in trust. The night sky continued to stretch endlessly above the turning earth, filled with stars, silence, and possibility. It no longer needed to speak. Humanity had finally learned how to hear, and so, the story doesn't end the way stories usually do. It doesn't close a door. It doesn't turn off the light. It simply lowers the volume of the world, just enough for you to notice your own breathing again. What unfolded in the sky was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be felt. A reminder that awareness can be shared, that silence can be intelligent, That listening is sometimes the most advanced response a species can learn. Nothing was taken away. Nothing was proven beyond doubt. And yet, something stayed. It stays in the pause before you react. In the moment, you look up without needing an answer. In the calm realization that mystery does not mean danger. Tonight, as you rest, the sky remains, as it always has, vast, patient, and quietly present. It does not demand belief. It does not ask for attention. It simply exists. And now, so do you, a little more gently within it. Sleep, knowing this. The universe does not rush, and neither do you have to. Good night. Good night.